comment earlier about is this basically similar to a perpetuity comes into play, because technically in one sense it is. Here we're simply saying this property is generating $30,000 a year of interest or income, if you will, to the lender. The lender is charging 8.9% as the interest rate on that, so therefore the amount that they're actually loaning out is $337,000. Now, if you don't quite follow it in that way, and I can kind of understand that initially, another way to sort of do it is work it in reverse. Let's say that we actually knew that the loan amount was $337,078.65, and we were just simply saying, okay, we know that the interest rate is 8.9% or 0.089, then by calculating that out, obviously with rounding, it may be a little bit off, but that's going to give us the $30,000 a year of interest. Take that, divide it by 12, and that's going to give us the $2,500 a month as the monthly payment. Does that make sense? There's just basically reversing it, just so that sometimes some folks can easily, perceptively pick up on going one direction or going the other, and sometimes you kind of have to work it back the other way to sort of maybe get perspective on what's actually happening. Okay? Yep.
Is this the vehicle that's used most often when money's cheap and markets are appreciating?
When things are appreciating so fast.
Well, usually interest-only mortgages pop up because borrowers can't afford the product. The prices have gone up. And so the lenders then say, how can we make it affordable? Well, we can make it affordable by dropping off the principal payments and having them only pay interest. We can also make it affordable by making it an adjustable rate mortgage and having that introductory rate super duper low to tease them, to get them to come in the door and make that loan, and then a couple of years later raise that interest rate up to something unsustainable. Okay? Now, it sounds like I'm painting lenders in a negative light and, and trying to basically say they're all evil and this and that and the other thing. No, I mean, I sort of play around with this a little bit, but the point is this. Lenders are in the business to do what? Make loans and make money. Okay? Now, there are some lenders that are obviously very straightforward, very honest, very, just nothing could be less clear than what they're doing. But in some cases, purposely, some lenders go out of their way to make things challenging to understand the underlying details so that the average ordinary person on the street is not necessarily going to follow what is happening or why it's happening or this or the other thing. It's all, and the point that I want to make with that is on the residential side of the business, the homeowner, purchasing their single-family residence, there are all sorts of consumer protection devices out there to try to protect the consumer and disclose all this information, in big, bold print. But just because the information is out there and is disclosed in big, bold print doesn't mean they read it, doesn't mean they understand it, doesn't mean, any of that. It's just the protections are there to try to keep some of that bad behavior from going on. Now, that having been said, on the commercial side of the business, most of it is buyer beware, okay? Most of it makes the assumption that you are an intelligent, sophisticated investor that knows what they're doing, that they are making investments in commercial property and they are dealing with commercial lenders. They know how this works. And so there aren't that many barriers for the lenders with regard to what they have to do and how they structure this. It's a much more complicated, sort of deal structure in many cases because the lenders know they can probably squeeze out maybe some additional fees from those folks that are not that sophisticated and inflate their rate of return. So, question.
So, on the commercial side, right, your investor, for this vehicle, right, so not necessarily here, right, but in areas with rampant inflation, is this the vehicle they use to hedge that?
The thought process is that whenever markets are hot and like they have been, that the lenders don't want to slow down the action, whether it's commercial or residential. They don't want to slow down the action, and they want to try to keep everything moving as swiftly as it can. But whenever affordability comes into play, then they start introducing a lot of these sorts of things that probably shouldn't be introduced in the first place. But the assumption on the part of the lender and the borrower is that the market's going to continue probably to escalate and only get better. The problem is, history has told us kind of over and over again, and once again, about a whole line of those people who refuse to sort of accept history or doomed to repeat it kind of thing. Well, it's the same concept here that these are sort of like the early warning signs of whenever these products begin to be kind of used more often, it's a sign that things have become overheated. Remember, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got in my entire life, this was probably in the mid-90s. I graduated college, started teaching in, like I said, the late 80s, and one of the reasons actually I ended up in teaching was because the job market was so horrific, in the 1980s, because the market had completely tanked. I mean, this is whenever real estate values, whenever you had, an investor had spent, let's say, $1 million on a property, and the properties were selling for less than $100,000. I mean, it was like, and this whole thing with the Resolution Trust Corporation, and this crazy stuff, had gone on in the 1980s, and so the job market sucked. And so I went into academics and, thought, well, okay, and eventually once the market recovers, kind of get back in. Well, anyway, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was this real estate developer who I met when I was teaching at UT Austin. He was one of the few people who got out of the market early enough before it crashed and had done very well. And his words of advice, or I never will forget this. He was like, everything was rocking along, everyone was making money, I was making more money than I'd ever made. And then I went golfing one day, and my golf caddy was talking about how much money he was making in real estate. And he said, whenever he told me that, the first thing that went through my mind is, if the average ordinary person is making money, the market's overheated, it's time to get out, and time to sell, time to cash out and run for the hills, because that shouldn't happen.
Smart guys,
though. But there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, from the standpoint that right now, that's almost exactly what's happening. That everybody and their dog, with a pickup truck, can get out there, flip houses, and I'm not saying that inherently it's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is, if the fundamentals for the market are not there, that things are overvalued relative to what they cost, you have to begin to question it. You have to sort of say, does this pass the smell test of, does it really make sense to make this investment when the market is this overheated? So it's a sort of thing that we know sort of inherently we're up here at the top of the market and we're starting to slide a little bit, but yet how quick that slide is and how bad it's going to be, that's the part we don't really know, and a lot of people just. But part of the problem is with real estate, especially with real estate development, is if you're a developer out there and you're halfway through building a condo tower or an apartment community or whatever, you can't just sort of say, okay, the market's about to turn, I'm out of here, and walk away from that. You're kind of committed, for an extra, 6 months, 12 months, a year, or whatever, and by then the market is maybe a very different market. So,
So, more from like the investor's perspective. So, like in this case, let's say we're in the trough. I doubt lenders would offer it in a trough, right?
it depends on what sort of security they have.
Okay.
You know, I mean, because even with an interest-only mortgage, they can still require a down payment.
Sure.
And they could still, you know, sort of say that if you've got enough skin in the game, you know, in terms of that down payment, then, you know, we'll potentially, you know, still make the loan. But there's also, you're also saying, well, what about these loans where they basically don't require much of any down payment at all? How does that happen? Well, see, that's another interesting component. It's a question of where you have mortgage brokers who don't necessarily work for the lender that they're representing. You know, so it's like, you know, you're maybe the lender, but you're the mortgage broker. You're selling a loan that she's backing, and she's expecting you to do a good job with the underwriting of that loan, and, you know, valuing, you know, that loan, and also doing a good job of qualifying the potential borrower. But in reality,
I get paid on volume.
you're being paid on volume, and, you know, you get stuck with some lousy loans that he made because he wasn't doing his job, because he was trying to get paid his commission. So, you know, but there's also a whole other element of this that we're going to get into, which is, you know, talking about the primary markets of mortgage lending versus the secondary markets. You know, because we're going to talk about this in just a few minutes. Okay, so you walk into a local lender and you get, whether it's a home loan, you get a building loan, you go, whatever. That local lender has typically a limit on the amount they have available to loan. You know, they don't have an infinite amount of money that they can loan out at any particular moment. So let's just say that their threshold is $100 million, okay, just to kind of keep things simple, a nice round number. So they got $100 million, they can loan this local bank, and so they give each of you, you know, $2 or $3 million here, $2 or $3 million there, and at the end of the day, they've lent out their $100 million, okay? Ordinarily, you just sort of say, okay, they're done. You know, they have no more money to lend, they're done, they're out of the game, you know, they just are going to collect whatever interest payments that, you know, you got coming in over the however long the loans are for. But see, that's not really inherently how it works. What happens is, once they've made that entire portfolio of, let's say, $100 million worth of loans, they package all of those loans up into this big deal that they then sell off to the secondary mortgage markets. Now, the secondary mortgage markets, those are people that may be, once again, pension funds, life insurance companies, super wealthy, you know, individuals or investors, whoever, that are just simply, they don't want to go through the brain damage of making the loans themselves, but they're happy to buy a portfolio of loans that, once again, is kind of like mailbox money, all right? Here's the problem. Well, I mean, I can continue the example. So once they have packaged up those loans and they've sold them off to that in the secondary markets, what does that do? That means that now they have another $100 million that they can now lend out, charge, you know, upfront fees on, and so forth, so on, and do the same, rinse and repeat, okay? And how quickly they can do that, and all this other sort of stuff, you know, kind of factors into it. But here's part of the problem. That in our first sort of financial crisis of all this sort of stuff going on in 2006 and 7 and that sort of thing, part of what was happening was that those lenders that had made those loans weren't really being held accountable whenever they were sold off. It was kind of like they're out of our, you know, it's sort of like we made the loans, you know, and they were, you know, solvent, and they were, you know, current and making their payments and everything on time, and we threw them into that pool, we sold them off, and everything was good, but then 2 or 3 or 4 years later, it all blew up, you know, within the pools. So, but the local lender was able to kind of have, you know, sort of say, we don't really, you know, have any responsibility, because that's after we basically sold it off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so we kind of get into almost another, you know, the whole thing of what sort of responsibility do they have long term, and was there fraud involved? Was, to what extent were they making loans they shouldn't have been making? Again,
Merrill Lynch went through a lot of that work.
No, I mean,
Did
many
they know
different,
they were selling bad loans or not?
yeah, I mean, many different lenders went through it, and it was, because it's very easy when you sort of step back from it, you sort of just say, okay, look, the market begins to tighten up, the people are still trying to make a living, and so what do they begin to do? They begin to cut corners, they begin to try to, introduce products they probably shouldn't be introducing, and so it's just, so I'm saying, it's sort of an early warning system of, things, beginning to go bad. The example I used to use, that only probably Woody will get, because once again, I know. But you remember that TV show Lost in Space, and the robot would always do the danger, danger, well, that's basically, what you should be thinking about, whenever.
And the rating companies were rating these loans that they had no business rating because they were just part of the whole mess.
Absolutely. There's many stories, I won't get into all of the nitty-gritty details, but the rating agencies, whenever they would come into the lenders and to the participants in the commercial mortgage-backed securities markets, many of these bond raters were not, let me just put it bluntly, many of them were bright, very young people who had graduated from some of the top schools in the country, but they knew nothing about real estate. And they were coming in trying to evaluate these portfolios of loans that they knew nothing about, and really couldn't do a good job in doing so. And so there were some inherent problems there as well of being able to truly assess how bad the problem was before it blew up.
So less cynical than I would have. I mean, unless you think that there was fraud going on at the rating agencies.
Well, and there was some of that too, in a sense that you had the rating agencies that you could argue had a vested interest in trying to keep their customer base and that sort of thing. And so there's all sorts of other issues there. But at the end of the day, what it really boils down to is lenders were making loans they should not have made, period.
So can I get back to the secondary
Yep,
market and
yep.
how these lenders were so easily able to get rid of their assets and, for more capital to spend? Would you say that the demand for these type of securitized mortgages would kind of drive the price down and kind of the investor preferences in the secondary market?
Well, what was happening is, once again, you had some players within the commercial, and we're going to get into commercial mortgage-backed securities later, but in general, the short answer to the question is that you had players within the market that were, you would think would be sophisticated, but weren't that sophisticated. It was surprising that you would have managers of multi-million, billion-dollar pension funds that, or for local government pension funds, or whatever that might be the case, that weren't the most sophisticated folks and did not fully understand how these securities worked.
They didn't have like a red light, green light, yellow light.
Yeah.
Well, there was some fraud in how they were rated.
Okay. You guys are leading me down the path, so might as well just get into it. All right. No, we're going to get to it. I mean, it's just a question of
MBS day one.
All right.
I'm
So basically, what we're talking about are commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBS. And this is the part you need to understand, and this is the part that helpfully will fill in the blanks for those of you that are sitting there, what the heck are they talking about? Okay, so here is the simple way to look at this. And I don't draw a very pretty picture, so you're just going to have to kind of live with me on this.
You said it's commercial mortgage.
Commercial mortgage-backed securities.
Is that a faucet?
Pretty much.
It's like a waterfall.
That's what it is. Basically, yeah, champagne glasses, wine glasses. Okay, most of you have been to marriages or your events where they've had this whole thing of where they've had these like stacked wine glasses or champagne glasses, and then somebody is pouring in here to the top one, and then it does what? Once the top one fills up, it overflows into the next ones, and then once those fill up, it flows into the next ones. Okay, everybody knows what I'm talking about, yes?
Cascading.
Cascading or waterfall, okay? Now, think of this as a financial instrument for a second, all right? That you have a certain amount of income that is being poured in here to the top, all right? So this glass, this top one, is always going to be full of money, yes? But yet, what if the money is not sufficient to fill up the first glass? Then the ones below it don't get any money, yes? Okay, so as we keep the fountain flowing of money, then these guys are getting their money and these guys are getting the money. So now, from a risk perspective, who has the most risk? Who has the least amount of risk in terms of getting money or not getting money? These guys have low risk. These guys have high risk. Do I follow that? And then these guys in the middle, kind of medium risk of getting paid. Does everybody follow? Yes or no? Okay, now, you're saying, well, okay, I'm still not quite sure how this all relates back to the whole real estate thing. Okay, you remember when I was talking about you had the $100 million of portfolio that the local lender made and they packaged up together into one big deal, okay? Well, think about that portfolio of loans. It's made up, let's say we've got 30-something people in here, with each one of you has like a $2 or $3 million loan that contributes into that, all right? Well, let's say that, most of you are making your payments on time, the property is performing the way that it should, everything is as it should be. But then, once again, Angelo has to be the problem, okay? Angelo, for whatever reason, defaults on his loan, okay? He's not able to make his payments, all right? And, not far behind him is Woody, okay? Woody, he stops paying, okay? Well, then the next thing you know, Ramsey stops paying. And then the next thing you know, Max stops paying. Well, then all the rest of you, you're continuing to pay, but think about what's happening here. All of these folks that stop paying, that means less money or less liquid, if you will, to basically flow into the coffers, okay? And so if you are expecting to generate, all of this revenue off of all those loans, what's happening is only this guy up here is really going to be guaranteed to be paid, and as people default, fewer and fewer of these guys are going to get any money at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're talking about security classes?
Yes.
Okay.
So these are basically different tranches. You sort of say tranche A, tranche B, tranche C, and so forth. And a tranche is nothing more than like a trench. It's basically, once again, the flow of water. That's how they like to sort of talk about these things, because it makes sense. It's easy to sort of relate to, that you're basically just pouring money and it's overflowing, and then at some point, you have no more money. This guy has been fully paid, this guy maybe partially paid, and this guy maybe not anything. Okay, now here is the problem. Okay, everybody understand the concept? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so the problem is this. This overall deal, that whole thing that we talked about with respect to your portfolio all being combined, that your average interest rate was set up to, let's say, be 10% overall. Okay? But what we're saying is, because, and we're going to structure this in such a way, these guys, since they have such low risk, we're only going to pay them a 5% rate of return. Okay? Because they're guaranteed they're going to get paid. These guys with the medium risk maybe is going to be a 10% rate of return. So they're going to, as long as everything performs as it should, they're going to get paid. But then these guys down here, are basically going to get a 15% rate. Well, you're saying, how can they get a higher rate of return than the overall portfolio? Because it's a weighted average. Okay? If you sort of say this is sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, okay, in terms of the cash flow, then basically by this guy only getting 5%, they can give this guy 15%. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay? So as long as everybody pays, and pays on time, and there's no default, everybody's happy. But, and they do model in a certain amount of default in non-payment, in early payment, and all of that sort of stuff. But what happens is, this guy down here, that if everything begins to collapse, this guy may get nothing. These guys, you know, hopefully will still get what they were agreed to get, but this guy gets maybe completely taken out of the game. But then depending on how bad things get, these guys could be completely taken out of the game as well.
Then he's losing the principal too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the point is, and this is the part where it goes beyond my simple explanation, but what you would do is, if you're the person trying to sell this whole portfolio, your tendency would be to structure this how. And this is where, once again, the financial folks are thinking about this, oh yeah, I can see instantly what you're talking about. What you would try to do as the financial guy trying to sell this to somebody is you would try to put virtually all of the income, virtually all of the loans in this one.
But that
And
doesn't
then,
happen that way.
no, but then what you would do is by doing it that way, then you as the organizer of this tranche will get to scrape off all of the excess to keep for yourself. Okay? Because you're trying to convince what should be a third, a third, a third. What you're trying to do, and the financial engineers that were sort of behind all this, instead of making this a third, a third, a third, they were sort of saying maybe 85% is going to be in that tranche, maybe 10% is going to be in that tranche, and 5% is going to be in that tranche, you know, for a total of 100%. And so if 5% of the loans went bad, these guys don't get paid at all. If 15% of the loans go bad, these guys don't get paid at all. Well, in reality, may have been 20 or more percent don't get paid. And so now all of a sudden, these guys that thought they had this super low risk, super insulated, you know, risk-free sort of security, not so much, because there were too many loans that were placed in that particular tranche.
More categorized,
Right. They weren't. That's another way to sort of express it. They weren't categorized, or the risk was not properly assessed as to this. Because here's you have very interesting restrictions on pension funds. One of those restrictions, it's called like ERISA, the Employment, Retirement, and Income Securities Act, I think is what it is. And for pension funds, they are pretty much restricted as to what they can invest in, and specifically what they are allowed to invest in are the equivalents of risk-free securities. Okay, does that make sense, hypothetically? All right, well, so normally their investment horizons pretty much led them almost exclusively to very low-risk government securities, like government bonds, you know, and treasury securities, and maybe some super AAA corporate bonds or something like that, okay? The financial engineering guys understood that and said, how can we create a security that will be appealing and allowable and available to these pension funds? Well, let's financially engineer a product of where we now create these 3 or more different classes of securities. The base asset is real estate, which normally pension funds were precluded from investing in, but this was a financial asset backed by real estate, but yet the whole idea was, what they were being sold was, this is risk-free. There's no chance you can lose your money. Invest with us, okay? And so they did. And you had millions upon billions of dollars that flooded into commercial mortgage-backed securities to help to fund real estate, commercial real estate specifically. And ultimately, what began to happen was the folks that were putting these deals together were doing so in a way that they really knew deep down that these were not truly risk-free securities, that they had a higher level of risk than they were actually letting on. And so that's where everything began to break down, is then as a result, the market sort of tumbled and crashed, and then it sort of exacerbated itself because of this kind of deal structure being put into place. And then it became incredibly difficult to unwind all of this, because these are not simple deals. You know, I'm trying to simplify it for you, but they're not simple deals in terms of how they're priced and how they're structured, and you know, who's responsible. Because, like, for example, let's say that you're one of those people that had borrowed that $2 million, $3 million sort of deal. There are very, very specific guidelines that you have to adhere to in terms of your payment structure and
Based on you.
yeah, and so, but it goes far beyond the obvious. And specifically what I mean by that is within these loans, as we're jump into it, is you would have provisions that would say you cannot prepay this loan before the end of 5 years. Okay? You're saying, you know, I'm going to wait 5 years before I can potentially sell this property and prepay the loan? Okay. Well, what if the market's really hot right now, and I'm thinking that 2 or 3 years down the road, whenever this thing, the 5 years is up, is not going to be so hot. Too bad, so sad. You're stuck with that. Well, I'm just going to sell it anyway. Well, then, woohoo, then comes the penalties, okay? And, you know, yeah, you're going to be allowed to sell it, but the penalty is going to be so stiff that you're not going to be able to, you know, withstand the loss, because that penalty could be 30% of the loan balance that you would have to pay as a prepayment penalty. Well, all of a sudden that pretty much negates your interest and ability to be able to prepay, so you're stuck owning it for the extra couple of years, all right? And so, and there are many other restrictions that sort of came with it as well that people were unaware of. Like, for example, one of the things that they had to do on a regular, consistent basis was, as the borrower, okay, think about it like this. Normal arrangement between a borrower and a lender, and any of you that have ever had loans, you can kind of understand and relate to this. You pretty much, you make your monthly payment, and the lender leaves you alone. You never hear from them, you never talk to them, you never deal with them, they leave you alone. Now, you miss a payment, you're going to start hearing from them. Yes? Okay? But as long as you're making your payment, you pretty much don't hear from them. Okay? And that's the way most real estate loans traditionally have been set up and structured. Well, with these sort of commercial mortgage-backed security loans that were being made, that knowing they were going to be sold in the secondary mortgage market, all these new restrictions began to be placed on them. Specifically, one of those sort of weird little restrictions was that if the property fell below a certain occupancy level, we're going to claim it's a technical default. Now, wait a second. Are you saying that if the property falls below a certain occupancy level, but yet you're still making your payment, they're going to claim a technical default? Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm saying. So in other words, you're making your payment. Should they be leaving me alone? No. They're coming in and they're saying, you fell below, whatever it was, 75% occupancy, therefore you are in violation of the loan documents, therefore we have right to claim technical default on your part, because their concern as the lender is, well, if you drop below a certain occupancy, that's to them early warning sign, danger, danger, and they want to potentially get that loan out of their portfolio or take over management potentially of that asset to avoid it going deeper into the drain. And so, and that may not be the only restriction. They may say that if you lose a certain key tenant, you're in technical default. If you, I mean, it's just almost endless of things that they can come up with, but most of the time, you know, it's driven off of this information that you are now required to provide them. In other words, in the past, once again, you weren't really required to provide them a whole lot of information as time went on about the loan. It's just like you make a payment, they'll let you alone. But they're saying with many of these loans, you need to provide us with a monthly operating statement on the property, okay? And it has to be submitted electronically. And what they will do is they have whole departments called surveillance departments that will take in all of that information off of all of these loans, off of all of these properties, feed into their systems, and then they will use the kind of the artificial intelligence slash, algorithms to basically say what is out of whack, what looks unusual, what doesn't belong here, kind of like the where's Waldo kind of thing, where do we find the strange and unusual thing that's going on, and by virtue of finding that, then come back and say, okay, once again, you're in technical default, something's bad about your property, you're not doing something you should be doing, and put that extra restriction on you of requiring that extra documentation. Well, that's not the end of the story. They may also require what are called lock boxes, okay, in terms of the payment. And what that means is that the tenants that all of you have in your buildings, that instead of making the rent payments to you and you and you as the owner of the property, they require all of the tenants to make the payments directly into this lockbox that is the lender's lockbox. The lender takes the payments, rent payments, not mortgage payments, rent payments, takes all of them, processes all of them, subtracts out their mortgage payment, and then remits the rest of it back to you, whatever's left over, so that makes sure that they get paid, before you try to abscond with any of the money from any of the tenants.
What makes someone agree to that?
I'm sorry?
Why would anyone agree?
I'm so glad you asked that question. All right. These are, in essence, these are all loans that have been set up specifically to be sold into the commercial mortgage-backed securities
This
market.
is just reading all the small fine print,
Yeah,
making sure you
right.
okay.
Yeah, and basically in the pooling and servicing agreement along with the loan docs, all of that stuff is in there. Now, your question, thank God somebody asked that question. Why would we ever agree to that as a borrower?
Well, maybe
You tell me.
Great deal.
Great deal, because the interest rate is better.
Decrease risk.
That is the number one mistake that people make whenever they go out looking for a loan. They're looking, what's the cheapest interest rate? I want the lowest interest rate. But there are strings attached, to that really awesome deal. So the fact that, yeah, you're getting a whole percent lower, on your interest rate, you're agreeing to all of these additional restrictions on what you can do with your property over the life of that loan. Does that make sense?
Are they kind of engineers who eventually take the property from you? Or is that
Not inherently, and not overtly, but it's kind of the sort of thing that inherent within that system, anything that blows up that's not normal, yeah.
have you seen it maybe where, because I mean, honestly, the only next step after that is like, okay, is the lender gonna start, managing your property for you and.
Well, that's in essence what they do.
tenants-
No, that's exactly what they do. They put it into what's called special servicing. And so within that special servicing, they then become the property managers, and they make decisions on who the tenants are. Literally, they've taken over control. And they will continue to do so until they figure out some sort of workout solution, whether it's selling off the property, whether it's basically getting it to a certain level where they can kind of send it back to the borrower. But they're not, none of that's for free. Once again, they're going to charge you for all those special servicing functions. Most of the time, whenever it gets to that point, it's pretty bad to begin with, but it is their sort of early warning system to sort of say, if there's something, like for example, if you were a commercial mortgage-backed security lender and in your portfolio right now, you had a bunch of Sears stores. Now, you would have already taken this into account quite some time ago, because this is not like a big secret that Sears is, going under, but many months, many years ago, you'd have probably said, I don't want any Sears in my portfolio, because there's a very good chance that store is probably not going to last much longer. And you would have gotten it out of your portfolio and diverted the risk to somebody else. But the point is that if there's some other retail store that maybe up to this moment has been very successful, and then all of a sudden something significant changes, and all of a sudden it's perceived not to be, so successful moving forward, that would be brought up in that sort of the early warning sort of surveillance system by that lender, and being able to say, this is, I need to deal with this. Exactly. And, instantly they would be saying, what is our exposure? How many loans, in our portfolio do we have that basically, fit that particular profile for whatever reason? Okay, all right? Okay, all right. Good cool discussion. All right. Question?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, so, let's see here. Okay, let's do a little negative amortization. All right, so we talked a little bit about this earlier, where you have a borrower, and I think, we talked about this whole thing of, well, what if they're not able to make their payments, or they're not able to make their full payments, or maybe they defer their payments for a period of time, and how does that sort of stack up and potentially work against them? So let's just sort of take a typical sort of mortgage loan, in 12 payments per year, and let's sort of say a $100,000 loan, keep things simple, and the interest rate on the loan, let's say, is 10%, and it's for 30 years. Okay, and so we get a monthly payment, just because I know that off the top of my head, our monthly payment's going to be $877.57. Okay, now, what's going to happen? This is the normal loan. This is what you've agreed to. This is what the lenders agreed to. This is what the borrowers agreed to. Making monthly payments of $877.57 for this loan for the next 30 years. Okay, everybody understands that? Yes. Okay, but going to your point, what if some sort of a special deal gets cut up front to where the lender basically is saying, look, I know you're just getting started in your business or in your life or whatever it is, and I'm willing to help you out by lowering your initial payments from $877.57 to $700 a month. Okay? So what that means is, after you sort of solve for this, you're going to go in and you're going to put in $700 a month as the replacement payment. Now, here's one of the questions that people are going to ask. Why didn't I just put that in initially? Or why don't I just, solve it? Well, because what you're doing here is you're replacing the solution here with a new amount that's actually going to be paid, okay? And so the calculator needs to reinsert that into the solution that's already been kind of created for this in order for it to work. So here's what's going to happen. Let's say that we want to see, how long do we want to forbear these payments? How long do we want to go without?
I was gonna say 30 years.
No, well, the whole term of the loan? No,
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No.
3 years.
3 years. yeah.
3 years, okay, good enough. All right, so let's do this. Going back to amortization. One input, 36, okay? Because 36 is 3 years times 12, okay? Shift, amortize, and then equal. Now, the only one we're really going to be concerned with is this part, the balance. Because what you're going to see, and this is the part that is the nasty part, you borrowed what? $100,000? And after making those less than normal payments, you're going to find that your balance is going to be much greater or significantly greater than what you originally borrowed. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's just see by how much. I have a calculator. There it is. Right. Okay, so you've only made 55, 70, 91 of principal. You've made 30,000, 770, 91 of interest. And your balance, after doing that, 105, 570, 91. So basically, you have added, by doing that deferment or lower the normal payment, you basically owe $5,500 more than what you started with after 3 years. Does that make sense? Conceptually. Okay? It's an example of negative amortization because you owe more than what you started with because you're not making payments sufficiently high to be able to pay out this balance. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that you're probably going to have to pick up the pace at some point, you know, in terms of being able, if you're going to continue on with this loan for how many more years?
27.
27 more years, then you're going to probably have a higher payment. Well, let's just see. I mean, this is, once again, this is where,
Now you gotta pay for 105.
so what you're going to do now, clear everything out, and your new loan amount is going to be the 105, 570, 91, and that's going to be for 27 years at the 10% interest rate and solve for the payment.
Is there like a copy function in this calculator?
No.
Nah, this one has it.
So basically, by doing, you know, what you had suggested, what ends up happening is our payment, our normal payment that was, when we started this thing, $877.57, is now going to be $943.91 because we only make payments of $700 a month for those first 3 years. Does that make sense?
That
Yep.
that 3-year hiatus and payment there would cost you a huge amount over the life of the loan compared to what it was initially, right?
I would agree.
How do you tell over the life of the loan?
Well, take this, multiply by 27 times 12, multiply this by 36, and then add it together versus this times 360. Okay? So in other words, just to, okay, so if we take 943.91 times 27 times 12, $305, $826.84, and then that's going to be plus the 700, and that's only going to be times 36 months. 25,200. Versus 877.57 times 360 months. $315,925.20. So basically a difference oops. 331,026 minus 315. 15,101.14. So that would be the extra amount of interest that you would have to pay because of that deferment. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, and the savings in the 3 years is 6,392. So that's the difference. It's like,
Right. So you pay now or you pay later? Fairly simple. Yep.
When they do these loan modifications,
this is basically, it's a negative amortization going on, right?
Okay, one more time. I didn't
When they
hear
do these loan modifications.
Yes,
for people,
that's exactly
they're
what-
putting it back on the back, and it's almost like you're paying double interest
Correct.
in a sense, right?
Yeah. Interest on interest.
Because the whole thing is you didn't meet your original obligation. And so now they're saying, because you didn't meet your original obligation, we're gonna, and we're gonna give you this break,
Yeah,
but we're gonna get our money on the back end.
yeah.
You know, it's not that they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart. Okay. Okay, so we got 5 minutes left. All right, any sort of questions? Do you feel like you learned anything today?
What does the
Okay.
call button mean? What does it do? Like officially, what does the call button do?
Clear all.
It's a guess. Space C, clear.
No, the other, not this call, this call.
Top right.
FB.
It says call above FB.
Yeah.
Oh, ignore that. No, it really, no, it has nothing whatsoever to do with,
Oh, you're talking about that see all, not
yes,
call?
yes, yes.
Oh,
All
I've
this
got
time-
working on all day, but that might cause
He
difficulty.
said it a couple of times.
Wow.
I know.
4 hours later.
I didn't get one wrong all day.
Any other questions? So here's what I would like for you to do, all right? I would like for you to break up into groups, and basically think about it like this. You need to have a study partner, or two, or three, all right? Ideally, I would say a study group no more than 4 people, all right? We've got about 30-something people, 36 people, I think. And so like 8 study groups, something like that, or 8 or 9 study groups, 9 study groups. And I would suggest that you get together and, you know, after you kind of work through the problems on your own, that you kind of get together with these folks and you work through some more, come up with some other, you know, example problems. You know, obviously you've been writing down the examples that I provided. You can obviously watch the videos. I'll be posting those and be able to kind of go back and review all of this. But try to get yourself prepared so that when you come in next class session, we'll kind of answer some questions, we'll work a few more problems, and then we'll take our first little quiz. Okay? All right? Is everybody clear on that? But I think it's a great idea for you guys to do some little groups. Now, I'm not mandating it, you know, it's one of those sorts of things. Past experience has sort of shown me that, you know, you folks, by breaking into smaller groups, you're going to probably be able to kind of help each other through some areas that might be useful. Okay, all right, so here's the plan. Most of you are coming back at 12:30. Once again, I do start precisely at 12:30. And if I were you, I would not eat a big lunch.
Out of town.
If you do, you're going to be sleepy, and that's not a good thing. So try to minimize it, but get back here by 12:30.
Go. You got your shark card. Look at you. Move. Usman.
You had the second class? Are you in the second class? Oh, you took that? You took that?
Because after 5 hours in the plane, and I just come in the morning. So just stick back. You got it? Like you know what, it's 8 hours.
Touch.
Especially now.
There you go, that's what I told you. But I just took the other class, I gave my daughter, and I'll find actually why I did it. I gotta find somebody else. You don't have it. I was nervous because I just came out of school.
Why won't I get electronic class?
And my computer and my calculator was
To relax your muscle. When I was
I was in a mess.
I mean, I waited for 5 minutes. I was in the plane. Because I had no
That's great. So your company moves to LA for good?
Oh, yeah. That's okay.
Did I take the other one?
Lake Montgomery County.
I'm giving 2.
All right. Then you go find something to eat, man.
This one already bought his food.
That's smart.
That's what, there's nothing in this building. There's nothing in this building. But I love this one.
I made
Investment bank, right?
No, No, but I have an MBA.
No, the investment class.
No, I took that in January.
In January?
You already took it now.
Yeah.
How was it?
Yeah, this is progressive
For it?
Yeah, but
Back when my kids came,